sa to počas dňa zlepší. Ako Ľubo spomínal, aj ja vás srdečne vítam na 3. ročníku najväčšej technologickej konferencie na Slovensku a medzinárodnom inovačnom a technologickom veľtrhu Slovakia Expo Forum Košice 2021. Sme naozaj veľmi radi, že ste prišli aj napriek rozbiehajúcej sa 3. vlne pandémie. Nic s tým neurobíme, ale aj vďaka spoločnosti Ruvirex, ktorá sa stará dnes o to, aby sme sa naozaj nenakazili. Tak to určite prebehne veľmi hladko, nielen dnešný deň, ale rozhodne aj ten zajtrajší. Kľudne sa k nám pridajte, vítajte. A práve spoločnosť Ruvirex má takú špeciálnu technológiu, vďaka vzduchotechnike tu bude počas celých dní prúdiť čerstvý vzduch. Ja teda nemám žiadne obavy, pevne verím, že ani vy. Témou tohto ročníka podujatia Slovakia Tech 2021 má názov Humanity Meets Technology, Technology Meets Humanity. Ľubo spomínal, že si môžete stiahnuť aplikáciu. Veľmi dôležitá informácia. Tak ako mňa bude zaujímať od mojich dnešných hostí veľa informácií. Hneď už pán Post za chvíľku nastúpi so svojím slávnym hamburgerom. To je neuveriteľná vec z oblasti inovácií. Tak aj vám odporúčam pýtať sa našich dnešných hostí. Nechodia na Slovensko každý deň, čiže treba to využiť. Stiahnite si aplikáciu Android aj iPhone s názvom Slovakia Tech. Nájdete tam kompletný prehľad, to znamená programu, menoslov speakerov 14. aj 15. septembra. Môžete si poprípade vybrať, kde sa vám hodí byť na konkrétnej prezentácii a čo vás zaujíma najviac. Čo sa týka ďalších informácií, a nezabudnite zavítať aj na susediace Expo, vystavujú tam 2 špičkové slovenské univerzity a košické a ďalšie slovenské inovatívne firmy. Čakajú nás hodiny, pevne verím, že veľmi zaujímavých, podnetných, obohacujúcich rozhovorov. Tých speakerov je viac ako dosť a organizátorom sa aj tento rok podarilo nabúchať ten program na maximum. Určite nuda nehrozí. No a v tej prvej časti by som teda slovo odovzdal pánovi Markovi Postovi. Hello, Mr. Foss, welcome. A poprosím vás, príďte na pódium, aby ste nám viac povedali o vašej inovácii. Začína sa konferencia Expo, Mark Post to odštartuje. Food Evolution sa volá tento panel, potrvá asi hodinku a Mr. Post je skúsený, aby vysvetlil, ako napríklad naozaj vzniká taký hamburger zo skúmavky. Neuveriteľná vec a sám som zvedavý, do akej miery to bude realizovateľné v praxi, a nie len za $100,000 alebo eur, ale či sa ich dočkáme konečne takéhoto produktu aj napríklad v reštaurácii. Please.
Thank you. The last part I didn't get. Good morning. This is, for me, I guess the second time now after COVID that I give a live presentation, and it's actually wonderful to do that again and to really interact with audiences. I'm going to talk about state of the art of cultivated meat. You may not have heard that much about cultivated meat yet. It was started in 2008 when we started a project actually funded by the Dutch government to work on technologies to create meat in a different way. And in 2013, we were able to, and I will show that a short video of that, we were able to present the first hamburger made out of stem cells from a cow. And this is now known as cultivated meat. There are a lot of terms for it, by the way, but cultivated meat seems to be kind of the predominant one. And it basically refers to that biotechnology to create tissues, meat in this case, from cells. So why are we doing this? Well, I love meat. And I'm not the only one. About 95% of the people love meat. And even 5% who are vegetarian and vegan, some of them still love meat, but they have the discipline to refrain from eating meat because of environmental or animal welfare concerns or whatever concerns they might have. And it's a problem. It's a problem because meat is a very resource-intense part of our diet. And don't make any mistake about it. We have been feeding the planet, the world, quite effectively. But it's getting more and more complex. It's getting more and more complex because of all the challenges of a growing population, but also changing demands of the population. We see that in areas where people become wealthier, like India and China, people start to eat more meat, or begin to eat meat because they previously could not allow it. It's kind of a status symbol, if you like. And then the third challenge is essentially climate change. It's both a result of meat eating, partially of course, but it's also a driver of increasing complexity in our food chain. Because with climate change, we will lose some agricultural lands. Some people claim that we actually will benefit from CO2. That's not entirely proven. So we have to assume, to be on the safe side, that it's going to become more and more complex in the future. And one thing that I would like to do is focus on some of the inefficiencies in this food system. And there are major inefficiencies in the way we produce food. There's a lot of food waste, but there's also meat. Meat is a very inefficient part of our food chain at the moment. So the why is actually quite clear. Why are we doing this? Well, these are kind of the numbers. They come from the FAO, the World Health Organization for Food and Agriculture. And it's clear that a lot of the greenhouse gas emission, a substantial part of greenhouse gas emission, actually comes from livestock agriculture. For the entire livestock, it's roughly between 15 and 20% of all our greenhouse gas emission. For beef alone, it's 8% of all our greenhouse gas emission. So it's quite substantial. We're also using a lot of fresh water to create meat. About 80% of all the, 22% of all the fresh water is used for livestock agriculture, and 80% of the agricultural land. Now that seems like surprising. How can 80% of all the agricultural land that we're using actually be gobbled up by cows and pigs and chicken? Well, the explanation is quite simple. These animals take their food, their feed, and convert it into animal proteins. And that conversion rate is actually quite bad. This is the conversion rate for beef, chicken, pork, salmon. Beef is the worst. We have to put eight times more food into a cow than we get out. It's a very, very inefficient technology, if you like. Then pigs and chicken are much more efficient, and salmon is almost as efficient as a plant. There's nothing more efficient than us eating plants. That's just the simple way it is. So we could all become vegetarian. We don't need animal proteins, right? Most of us have grown up with that myth that we need animal proteins. But guess what? There are 2 billion people on this planet who hardly eat any animal proteins, mostly because they cannot afford it. And they live, and they procreate, and they're happy, and they're creative and active. We don't need specifically animal proteins. If you're a vegan, so if you're a vegetarian, everything's fine. If you eat an egg once in a while or a fish or whatever, everything is fine. If you're a vegan, you have to pay attention, in all honesty, because you need to get the certain amino acids, which are the building blocks of our proteins, certain amino acids that we can only get out of food. We cannot make it ourselves. There are 8 of them, 9 of them, amino acids that we cannot make ourselves. We have to get it out of food. So you have to be pretty particular of what your sources of food are going to be. And of course, there's the famous example of vitamin B12, which is actually not made by cows or by chicken or by pigs. It's made by bacteria. We cannot make vitamin B12, yet our lives are critically dependent on vitamin B12. And it's solely a bacterial product. And it happens to be stored in muscle. So it is a decent, and in liver and a couple of other organs, so it is a decent source of vitamin B12, but it's definitely not the only one. You can get it from bacteria as well. So in theory, we can all become vegetarian. And I'm actually reasonably sure that eventually we will go towards a more plant-based diet. You see that happening throughout the world, and eventually this is going to happen. It will take a long time, because we're all stuck on meat, including myself. Globally, the trend is actually going the other way. This is greenhouse gas emission from livestock agriculture. And you see that the lines look pretty flat. This is for Europe. It's completely flat. We are not increasing our meat consumption that much. But look at Asia. And look at Africa. Those lines are increasing. They're rising. So this is where the future meat consumption is coming from. And since we are already using 80% of all our agricultural land to create meat, this is not going to happen. We don't have enough planetary resources to meet the demands of Asia, Africa, and China, India, and Africa. So, in essence, we don't really have a lot of choice. Either going towards a more plant-based diet, which would be fine, or find different ways to eat meat, or something in between where we eat less and less meat and replace it more and more by a plant-based diet. So what we realized, and this was not really a new idea, this was actually something that had been in Victorian literature, in England, in sci-fi literature, has been proposed, and even Winston Churchill in 1932 posed the idea and published the idea that you potentially could make meat from stem cells, not from cell culture or tissue culture. He didn't use the word stem cells back then because it wasn't there. And what it so happens that our muscle tissue, actually most of our tissues in our body, have stem cells. And stem cells are creatures that can proliferate for a long time. And they can regenerate our tissues. So this is the way bones heal, muscle actually heals, skin heals, all those, our intestinal system heals, all those are the result of stem cells sitting there waiting to repair that tissue when it gets old or when it gets injured. And our muscle cells are particularly abundant places of stem cells. Every muscle cell has 5. A muscle cell is a bit of a peculiar cell because it's already a merger of a large number of cells. But every one of those cells have 4 or 5 what we call satellite cells. And those are the stem cells of muscle. So essentially what we do, we take a biopsy from a cow, get a very small piece of muscle out of it, something about 0.5 gram, has a couple of hundred of these stem cells. And we take the cells out. We actually currently divide them because it's very convenient, actually. Those muscle tissues have both stem cells for muscle, but they also have stem cells for fat. So from the same sample, we can get both stem cells and create both muscle tissue and fat tissue, and then later combine them into a patty. So it's biology, right? So it's kind of a high-tech biology. So we are able to separate those stem cells, to separate the stem cells from the regular muscle cells and the regular fat cells, but also separate the muscle stem cells and the muscle fat cells from each other. This is important because they require different growth conditions over time. All right, so we separate them on the basis of a couple of characteristics. So muscle cells on the left and fat cells on the right. And then we let them do what they do best, proliferate. That is something that is very easily done. I will come back to it later because there are obviously quite some challenges still there, but it's relatively easy to get them to proliferate. It's a little bit harder to get them to proliferate for a long time and at very high scale, very big scale, but it's easy to get them to proliferate. And then for muscle tissue, they need to become muscle fiber. So the first thing they need to do is they need to merge into a larger cell. As I mentioned, a skeletal muscle cell, so as they are in our body, are actually very, very big, and they contain hundreds of cells. And we know that because they contain hundreds of nuclei, little white eggs here in the picture. So the way they become muscle fibers in the lab is actually very easy. We take out all the stimuli for them to proliferate. And then they stop proliferating and they start to immediately to form these muscle fibers, pretty much by themselves. Very, very elegant. So what we did, then we need to do another little trick. We need to get those muscle fibers who are not really muscle fibers yet. They don't have the proteins, they don't contract yet. So they don't have all the characteristics of the muscle fiber. For that, they need to form a tissue. And to form a tissue out of those, we do two things. We put them in a gel, and that gel allows them to find each other and to attach to each other and form a tissue. They also do that by themselves, but they have to be facilitated by this gel to some extent. And then we put them in a ring structure. Why in a ring structure? Because if they find each other and they form that tissue, they start to contract. And when they contract and they are in this ring structure, that elicits tension. That basically results in tension because they need kind of anchor points in their system. And the tension is the biggest trigger for protein synthesis. You all know that. If you run marathons, you probably don't all run marathons, I don't, but if you run marathons, you don't get thick muscles. If you go to the gym and you pump iron against a resistance, so you create tension in those muscles, you get thick muscles. So that's essentially what we are doing here. We let them produce tension, and that tension is the biggest trigger for protein synthesis. So it takes about 3 weeks, actually slightly shorter at the moment, about 10 days. And then you have a muscle fiber that under the microscope looks exactly the same as a muscle fiber that you take right out of the cow. So what we did in 2013, we presented that first hamburger. This was purely muscle. There was no fat tissue yet. And we presented it in a hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference in London. It was broadcasted over the entire world because we wanted to show to the world that this can be done. The technology is there. And also we wanted to sensitize people that we should think about how we're going to produce meat in the future. Now that hamburger cost us €250,000 to make. So that's not really a product, right? It was kind of a proof of concept, and it was tasted by those two people, Hani Rützler from Austria and Josh Schoenroth from Chicago, and they said, oh yeah, this is meat. It was not a particularly good hamburger, but at least it was meat as we know it. So that's nice. How do you go from there to create something that could really transform the meat industry? So let's recap for briefly a moment what we're doing. We are taking a biopsy from a cow, we're isolating the cells, we let them proliferate, we let them make tissue, both muscle tissue and fat tissue, and we make a hamburger. How are we going to make this process efficient and scalable and cost-effective? Cell culture is a medical technology. Tissue culture is a medical technology. It's not designed to be efficient or to be cost-effective. And typically, it's not. So what you can do is you can work on those culture conditions. And for scaling up, you can work on basically systems other than, let's say, a Petri dish to make your cells and to make your tissues. And you can work and improve cell selection. I mentioned in that sort of simple slide that we separate the muscle cells from the fat cells, but actually within that muscle fraction, that muscle precursor stem cell fraction, there are subpopulations that are more efficient than others. And the same is true for the fat stem cells. So we can work on the stem cells, the cell selection, culture conditions, and essentially looking at other systems to scale up. So this is one such system to scale up. This is a system where, so we need to move from Petri dishes to something that is scalable. Now the peculiarity of these cells, in fact most cells that we culture outside of the body, have to adhere to a surface. They cannot really float, they cannot swim. So they have to adhere to a surface, which is a little bit problematic because you have to provide that surface. So for a cell culture dish, it's easy. The surface is just the bottom, but obviously there's not a very favorable volume to surface ratio, so it will never be very efficient. So what other people have done, this was a technology that essentially existed already, have used microcarriers. These are spheres of about 150 microns, so 1/10 of a millimeter in diameter. And they provide the surface for the cells to grow on. And the beauty of these spheres is that you can suspend them in a volume. And now you have transferred that from a planar system with a very unfavorable volume to surface ratio to a volume system, to a tank essentially, a fermentation tank, which conveniently are around already. Think about, you know, the fermentation tanks for brewing beer and wine and that sort of thing. So essentially that technology is there, scalable, and you can use, therefore, this technology to transfer that cell culture to a system like that. So we have worked on that quite a bit. We have tested all of those microcarriers. We have designed our own microcarriers for that, edible microcarriers, degradable microcarriers, you name it. We have tested them, and this is really part of the research that is quite promising in getting it in a more and more efficient manner. What is even nicer is that we can actually eventually get rid of those microcarriers and let the cells grow in aggregates. So when you define the conditions quite nicely, the cells actually form aggregates, and then they don't need a sort of artificial surface to adhere to. They adhere to each other, and they grow and they expand. So we have done that both for the muscle cells. This is for the muscle cells, but we also have done that for the fat cells. It works quite nicely. And the beauty of this is that we don't have those microcarriers anymore that create two problems. One is that they take up space, so they limit the amount of cells that you can grow in a certain volume. And the second is that you need to, at some point, separate those microcarriers from the cells. So it makes it easier if you can grow them in aggregates. We are doing this to eventually reduce the number of cows that we need to make our meat. And for that, of course, we need that proliferation capacity to be as high as possible. So currently from 0.5 gram, we can make 2,000 kilos. So that will reduce the number of cows already tremendously. And that's because we can get currently to 32 doublings. So every cell can double like 32 times. And you can do that exponential math. It's very, very easy. And if you know how many cells there are in a kilo of meat, you can calculate the kilos of meat that you can make out of that. Now, in the 60s, well, actually earlier than that, in the 40s, 50s, Hayflick, a German biologist, calculated and experimented that most cells in our body can actually double 50 times. We haven't gotten there yet with these particular cells. We are getting better and better. It's increasing every couple of weeks. But if we get to 50, imagine, from that same 0.5 gram of tissue, we can make 2 billion kilos of meat. Now, again, we're not there yet, but that is theoretically, at least, the possibility. So currently, we are taking about 20 biopsies per animal. That means that we're producing 40,000 kilos per animal, and that we would need eventually, with this math, only 0.6% of the cows that we currently are using for our beef production. By the way, this is quite similar for chicken and pork and fish. So there are now companies that are doing each of them. Every creature that has these stem cells in their muscle, you can basically make the meat from. All right, so what does this look like, this production system? You take the biopsy from the animal, you start with very, very small number of cells. Actually, this doesn't work. A very small number of cells. You cryopreserve them, you freeze them so that you can use them later on. And then you gradually grow up that number of cells. And then, in the end, as I mentioned, you go to these tanks. And a farm in the future would look a little bit like this. like these bioreactors, like currently a brewery or a winery. If you do, again, those calculations and you, let's say, take an average, it's actually already quite large, farm in the Netherlands of 250 cows, which produces about 35 tons of meat per year. If you would replace that by these bioreactors, you need 4 of those bioreactors of 1,000 liter each. 1,000 liters is not a particularly big bioreactor. It's actually a relatively small bioreactor. They go up to 500,000 liters now. Not for animal cell culture, but for other purposes, but they do exist. So this is entirely doable to replace that farm with a fermentation system. On a world scale, if you would transform the entire beef production in the world by fermentation technology, by cell culture and tissue culture, you would need 20 million cubic meter of bioreactor volume or fermentation volume. And that number probably doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell me anything. But it's about 1.5 the times of the fermentation capacity that we currently have in the world. And that's a substantial increase. Think of all the fermentations, the beer, the wine, the biosimilars, all the medication that is being made. So it's quite a substantial increase of that volume of bioreactors, but it's certainly not undoable. All right, so that's about scaling up and making, and if you scale it up, you make it more efficient. I will come back to the efficiency a little bit later because we're also going to recycle. This is a technology that is contained. It's not like a cow open in the meadows. It's contained in a room, in a bioreactor. We can recycle, and we will. But there are 2 other issues that I need to discuss first. One is that traditionally, to grow cells outside of the body, we needed serum. Serum is a blood-derived product from animals, essentially, from cows. And you add that to the feed of the cells. Now, of course, if we're doing that, we still need cows to produce that serum. So we didn't want to do that. So we had to get rid of the serum. And that gel that I mentioned that allows the cells to create that tissue was actually in 2013 derived from animals, was a collagen derived from cows. So we needed to get rid of that too. So we have spent quite a bit of time on replacing that serum. Here you see growth curves. On the y-axis is growth of cells, and on the x-axis is just test time. And you see growth curves. And the blue one actually is the curve that with serum, and the other ones are all serum-free formulations. What we essentially do is replace that serum with a couple of proteins. It's about a handful of proteins that do the same thing as serum. So we've kind of cracked that problem. It's both for muscle cells and for fat cells. You have to do that specifically for every cell type, which is kind of painful, but it's definitely doable. And the gel, I don't have a slide of that, but the gel we have replaced by another gel, by basically a gel from algae. Agar, I don't know whether you know that. That's a plant-based algae-based system where you can make gels, food-grade gels. We use that system now to create those gels to let those cells find each other and form a tissue. This is a very complex slide with a lot of information. On the left-hand side, we have the essential amino acids. Remember, I told you that there are amino acids that we have to get out of our food. We cannot make them ourselves. And these are called the so-called essential amino acids. So these, 9 guys are the ones that have to be also in the feed for the cells. Otherwise, they don't thrive. The ones on the right, they can make themselves. What this is telling you, this is a 7-day culture. The yellow bars are after 7 days. It's a 7-day culture. And that after 7 days, even of those amino acids that we have supplied that the cells cannot make, some of them are actually still there. They are not really consumed by the cells that much. And typically after 3 or 7 days, we throw away the medium. The medium is the feed. Why do we throw it away? Because the cells are essentially growing in their own urine, right? They metabolize, they make ammonium, they make lactate, and that accumulates in that same fluid. And it actually hurts the cells eventually. So we have to refresh that medium once in a while. And typically you do that after 3 days. Currently we do that after 10 days through a metabolic engineering trick that I don't really have time to talk about it, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. But even after 7 days, there's a lot of feedstock still in that medium, and we throw it away. That obviously is unacceptable if you want to make this an efficient technology. So what we are currently doing is taking out that ammonium, actually coercing the cells to produce less ammonium. Ammonium is the biggest culprit. Lactate is less kind of problematic. So we're allowing the cells to grow much longer in that medium, and we supplement those amino acids like these, methionine and isoleucine and leucine and serine, that are being depleted and that you have to supplement to make sure that the cells keep on growing. So gradually, by removing ammonium, by coercing the cells to produce less ammonium and less lactate, and actually in some cases even use ammonium, we can use that cell culture medium for a longer and longer time and make it a more efficient system. And that's it. Oops, sorry about that. And that's necessary because in the end we are doing this for environmental reasons. Now, the question is, could this technology be more kind of environmentally friendly than just a cow in a pasture? And we know the issues with the cows. They are inefficient and they exhale or burp methane because they have these fermentation activities. There's bacterial fermentation activities in their stomachs. So they're responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emission. And you see that here in this. This is a study that was recently done. It's a life cycle analysis. It's an anticipatory life cycle analysis. Anticipatory because you can only do these life cycle analyses properly if you know the entire production system and transportation system and where your feedstock is coming from and so forth. So there are 5 of these now, 5 of these studies, and they all are, again, anticipatory. This is the latest one, and I like kind of this one because it has, for 2 reasons, it has kind of made a compound, simple parameter to evaluate its influence on environment. So it's compounded by global warming, land use, water consumption, fine particle matter, human toxicity, and other, like antibiotic use and things like that. And you see that what everybody agrees upon is that of all the stuff that we eat, beef is actually the worst for meat. And dairy is the second one, the second worst. Now, and you see that chicken and pork are a lot better. That is, again, the result of the fact that they don't emit methane. They don't have that same fermentation system that ruminants typically have. And they're more efficient in converting their feed into animal proteins. And you see here 2 entries for cultivated meat, conventional and sustainable. So conventional is better than beef, but worse than chicken and pork. Sustainable cultivated meat is better than chicken and pork, but still not as good as plant-based diet. There's nothing as good for the planet as a plant-based diet. It's as simple as that. So what's the difference between conventional and sustainable? It's essentially the amount of, not the amount, the type of energy that we need to keep this going from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. And then you end up not in this area, but in that area, because that's all those life cycle analyses agree on the amount of land saved by cultivated meat, the amount of water saved by cultivated meat, they disagree on the amount of energy that's required. And some claim that the energy component is higher than for conventional livestock agriculture. But this has implemented kind of an energy transition. Mind you, if this transformation is going to happen over the next decades, we hope, and that means that it's going to be in parallel with an energy transition. So this is the different components of the impact on the environment of cultivated meat, and of course, energy in blue here is the biggest part. So that's fine. It's still, that's kind of promising, right? But on the other hand, this meat also has to satisfy our craving for meat. Remember, 95% of us is meat eater, although I guess a lot of you already knew the issues with meat consumption. Who of you knew these numbers associated with meat consumption and the impact on environment? Nobody? Really? Okay, so you were not one of the ones who knew about this, or you basically, that's perfectly possible. The psychologists have a term for this. It's called cognitive dissonance, that you basically push it away in a dark corner of your conscience because you like meat so much, right? That's entirely possible. I'm not saying that you do, but you might be. Trust me, I don't know how it is here, but in the Netherlands, where I'm from, you cannot open a single newspaper pretty much every day without reference of livestock impact on environment. And actually the current government, or it's now in transition, but one of the things they struggle with is really acknowledging at a political level that we should start to eat less meat. It's a difficult message for a politician to say, but the facts are actually quite clear in that. All right, but in order to satisfy the craving of meat for some of us, most of us, it needs to be good. It needs to be high quality. It needs to have the same color, the same texture, the same flavor, essentially identical to the meat that we know. So how do we get there? Well, these are muscle fibers that are made by us, and they are actually under the microscope and protein-wise indistinguishable from muscle fibers that you know. This is what it looks like. It's just a pretty picture, I'm sure. It doesn't tell you very much because you don't look through microscopes a lot. This is what we create without serum, without animal-based components, just the stem cells of cows. And here we look at the protein content. And this is just the protein content. For the protein composition, it's kind of similar. So here on the left, there's minced meat, just straight coming from the supermarket. And on the right, the right from 4.5 to 9 are samples of our meat that we made. Same protein content. If you look at the composition and you look at the proteins that are most abundant in muscle, same thing. So from a nutritional value point of view and from a structure point of view, they are the same. For fat, it's even more striking. So this is a fat tissue. You may not have looked at fat tissue that much, at least not under the microscope, but it's very big globes of fat. And actually the nucleus of the cell is somewhat squeezed to the outside of the cell. It's one big fat blob. This is essentially that green stuff stains fat. It's essentially what we make in our tissues. Here the tissues are a little bit easier to make than for muscle because fat tissue is not a highly organized piece of tissue and it doesn't really contract. So it's now this was already very nice to see for us. What was even nicer, that if we look at the lipid composition of that fat tissue, this is fat coming from a cow. This is the 2 pieces of fat that we made. And if you look at, and the color coding is essentially lipids that are in that tissue. So it goes from, I don't know how much you know about lipid chemistry, but it goes from 16 C atoms to about 22 C atoms. And behind the colon is the number of saturated bonds in that lipid. And you see, they're the same. They're not exactly the same, but at this level of inspection, they are pretty similar. So we were extremely happy with the result. It was also tasted. It tastes like cow fat, and obviously fat is a big component of taste, right? If you take, I don't know whether you've ever did a blind tasting of pieces of meat coming from a cow or a pig or a lamb. If it's very lean, trust me, you cannot find the difference. If there is a sliver of fat in it, you immediately know, oh, this is pig, this is cow, this is lamb. So a lot of the flavor actually comes from the fat. Now I mentioned those saturated bonds in those fatty acids, and of course we know that saturated fatty acids are not good for us. We would like to have as much unsaturated fatty acid in this lipid profile as possible. Now, cow fat cells can perfectly make unsaturated fatty acids. It depends a little bit on their diet whether they do it or not, but they can. And our cells also can make unsaturated fatty acids. So potentially, we have not done that yet, but potentially we can make a hamburger that is actually healthier for you, that has lower amounts of saturated fatty acids and higher amounts of unsaturated fatty acids so that it lowers your cholesterol. This technology allows us to make minced meat, not a full steak. And of course, we also want to make full steaks like ribeyes and filet mignons and things. And it can be done. It has been done in the medical field to make complex tissues and full thickness tissues. But it's kind of the next level of complexity. For sure it can be done, but we are not doing this currently. There's one company out there that is that has started basically immediately with full thickness pieces of meat. And the last really condition for this to transform the meat industry is that you have to eat it. When we presented this in London, the popular press said basically, yuck, right? This is not what is kind of appetizing. And I was a little bit taken aback by that, because not because of the reservation, but because I didn't quite understand where that came from. And nobody could really explain to me where that came from, that reservation. So I had to kind of find out myself. And I eventually came up with 3 components of this. One is just familiarity, right? We are biologically programmed not to eat things that we don't know. Now, who of you has ever eaten a hot dog? Quite a few. Do you know what it is? Cardboard. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. We are perfectly capable of eating stuff that we don't know what it is or how it's being made. Do you know how hot dogs are being made? Do you want to know? Probably not. This is apparently some of the local sausages. In Germany, I usually refer to Weisswurst, which is a little bit like that one up there. And Weisswurst is the same thing. People don't know exactly what it is. Even in Germany, they don't know what it is. But they do eat it. It's actually a very nice product. It's actually pretty much veal. And it's a relatively high-quality product relative to whole pieces of meat. But that's not the point. The point is that people don't know what it is, and they still eat it. So why is that? Why do you eat something that you don't know what it is? And my guess is that you do that because you have seen your neighbor eat it, and your neighbor stays alive. Right? So you gradually get the idea this is a safe food to eat. And that's exactly what that biological program should do, prevent you from eating stuff that is not safe. And if you see other people eat it, and it's in the supermarkets, and it's regulated by the Slovakian government or by the European Food Safety Authority, we gradually get that idea that we can eat this. So this takes time, and it takes early adopters. The second is that this now converts something that is made by nature into something that is made by people. And nature is, kind of a million years of evolution. You cannot change that much. If you convert this to something that's man-made, people may make mistakes. They may be fraudulent. They mess around. And so we get the sense that we lose control over how our food is being produced. This is something that is evident now in society, that people want to have traceability. Where does my food come from? We have kind of that tendency, although most of us still buy it in the supermarket having no idea where it comes from. So that you can solve by doing this at a small scale in communities, so that people have the feeling, oh yeah, it's coming from there. Right, and not from somewhere far away. And then the final element is something that is a little bit more tricky, and that is that meat is more to us than just food. Right? It's a culture. It's associated with fire, masculinity, power, supremacy over another species. Right? All that kind of hunting instincts. Now you may not feel that anymore. But let me tell you a tiny story. 3 years ago in the Netherlands, there was a commercial for barbecue sauce. And believe it or not, it was a commercial where Sylvester Stallone had a machine gun, was in a fighting situation, and he was trailed by a Dutch actor, a wimpy actor. And he was, killing half a dozen of people, and in the movie. And then they had a break, and they had lunch at break. And Sylvester Stallone put a big plate of steaks in front of this Dutch actor, and he literally said, "If you want to fight like a man, you have to eat like a man." And then the barbecue sauce came in. This is the Netherlands 3 years ago, right? That sentiment is still somewhat out there. Now, if you start making this in a factory, it becomes essentially a broccoli, a very carefree, wimpy version of meat, if you like. All right, so we did a study. This was actually the first psychological study that I ever did in my life. We did a study in the Netherlands, the south of the Netherlands, where we asked the question, what type of information do people need to accept this? Because there was a lot of marketing people out there that said, well, basically people are only interested in their own benefits. If this has benefits for people, like health benefits or whatever, they will be fine. If it's a societal benefit like animal welfare or environment, nobody cares. You care, of course, but it doesn't determine your choices of food, right? Yet. Okay, so what we did, we divided a cross-section of the Dutch population in 3 groups, and each got different type of information. Information about societal benefits of cultivated meat, information about personal benefits of cultivated meat, it's healthier for you, and so forth, and just information about its high-quality meat. And then we asked a lot of questions on acceptance. Do you think this is a good idea? Do you want to replace your consumption with cultivated meat, and so forth? And then we had to let them eat a sample. We had have them eat 2 samples, one conventional meat and one cultivated meat. Now the trick was that the cultivated meat was also conventional meat. It was just labeled as cultivated meat, right? So we made the piece a little bit smaller and so forth. And then we had them comment on the the quality of the meat. So the outcome, wait a minute, these are reversed. Okay, so the outcome was kind of interesting. So we had questions before, so we asked questions before we gave the information, after the information, and after tasting. Societal benefit, personal, and quality was the color coding, and you see immediately there was no difference between the different colors, right? So whatever information we gave really didn't matter. The fact that we gave information did matter, right? Before and after information, we immediately got a higher acceptance for all the 4 questions that we asked. And interestingly, we had them, they tasted these, and they found that the cultivated, that the sample was labeled as cultivated, tasted better than the conventional one, although they were exactly the same. And all ate the piece that was labeled cultivated. Now, that things taste better if they're more exceptional. We already knew that. If you take a jug of wine, jerry can wine from the local supermarket, and you pour it in a very expensive bottle, then it starts to taste better. So that we kind of already knew that that was happening. Can I go back with this? I can. Okay. So over the time, this started in actually 2011, but over the years, a number of surveys have been done. Where people were asked, do you think this is a good idea? And if you look at the blue bars, this is, yes, we think it's a good idea. You kind of see that it's roughly currently at around 50% of people who think this is a good idea. It starts to increase a little bit over time. And wherever you do these questioning, whether it's in India, China, or the US, or the UK, or the EU, doesn't really matter that much. So this is kind of promising. Still, it's a very theoretical approach. All right. So is this going to happen? Well, for sure, I hope, and I think you should also hope that this is going to happen. Otherwise, we don't have really a lot of alternatives. This is from a consultancy company that predicts that in 2040, which is about 20 years from now, this will be roughly 35% of the market. And of course, plant-based will also be about a quarter. And interestingly, they see this kind of plateauing over time. I'm not sure why. For this to happen, you need to eat it, and for you to eat it, it needs to be high quality. We discussed it. It also needs to be low price, because eventually in the supermarket, you determine your choices on quality and price. Now, can we get there? Can we get to the same price as meat, or even lower than that? Theoretically, we should be able to, because 70% of the cost of conventional meat is the feed of the animals, right? And it's the same in our case. It's the feed of the cells that contain, that is the cost of production. So currently we are, remember that first hamburger was €250,000. Currently we are at about €140 per kilo. Now that's still way too much, but it's already come down from that huge amount. How do we get from here to price parity with regular meat? Well, we have to source those materials from different sources. Currently, they are pharmaceutical grade, they are in the medical industry, very, very expensive. So we are increasingly trying to source them from just plants. So this is, I apologize, the x-axis is anonymized, but these are all protein hydrolysates from wheat, from cotton, from peas, from soybeans. And if you, at 100% level is where these hydrolysates are able to replace the amino acids in that feed. And you see that some of those hydrolysates are perfectly capable of replacing the amino acids in the feed. And we're doing the same for the vitamins and the minerals. So this will eventually, and these are an order of magnitude cheaper than the typical ingredients that we use in the system. When we did this in 2013, we were the only ones. There are currently 80 companies in the world doing this in Silicon Valley, Israel, Western Europe, actually now basically throughout the world. Some focusing on beef, some on pork, some on chicken, some on fish. So this is rapidly increasing. I have to update this slide pretty much every couple of weeks. It is a novel food. It's identified by the EU and by EFSA as a novel food. That means that you have to get regulatory approval, so we have to provide safety information, and that has to be approved by EFSA and then by the EU. And the same is true for other geographies. Currently, there's one product in Singapore that has been approved as of December last year, but the rest is kind of following in the coming years. It's not genetically modified, so that makes it a little bit easier, but it has to still be approved. So my hope for the future is that we can continue to eat meat as we know it, without the negative externalities on the environment. And this technology is one that can provide that. And we're getting there. Thank you.
Dámy a páni, Mark Post, thank you very much. Do we have any questions? Uvidíme možno na našom slajde. Dámy a páni, stiahnite si našu aplikáciu Slovakia, tak odporúčam, pretože tam okrem kompletného programu uvidíte samozrejme aj ďalších speakerov, menoslov speakerov a hlavne môžete položiť prostredníctvom našej aplikácie otázku pre našich hostí. Žiadna otázka?
There's a question here on the screen. Sure.
Ja vás bohužiaľ nepočujem. Ospravedlňujem sa, ale nie je to tu počuť. Čiže poprosím možno kolegov to zabezpečiť. Ak sa chcú niečo opýtať našich hostí, kľudne môžu. Ja si myslím, že pán Posto aj bude možno počuť, ak to vieme zabezpečiť. Alebo ak sa to vie ukázať. A už máme niečo aj na našom... Mr. Post? When do you see the first mass product meat to reach the market?
Yeah, so I kind of answered that question. And I'm happy that you said optimistic estimation, because that's... so in Europe, it's going to take at least another year and a half, if not 2. And the reason for that is that EFSA takes a year and a half to get it approved. Singapore takes 3 to 6 months, right? So that's why in Singapore now there's already a product on the market. It's not really on the market, but you can get it if you really try hard. But in Europe, it's going to take at least a year and a half because of the regulatory approval. And so far, no applications have been sent in to EFSA yet, as far as I know. And so it's probably more like 2 years. We're going to send in our application in the next couple of months. And if it's really that year and a half, then it's roughly about 2 years. Most optimistic estimation.
A skvelé, už máme zabezpečený mikrofón, tak to bude jednoduchšie.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully now it will work. So I was wondering, when you were showing the data on the environmental impacts, or rather the societal impacts of like the different options, including the cultured meat, both for like the conventional and the sustainable, are those data which are like with the cultured meat as it is today, or is it rather a projection, you know, like when it gets to an industrial scale, how it would compare to the regular options?
It's a projection. It's really a projection, and it has to be, because you know, if you look at the system right now, where there is still not enough scale, still not a supply chain that is different from the traditional medical supply chain, it would not make any sense. So it is a projection, assuming a lot of these all of the anticipatory life cycle analyses make assumptions about how this technology is going to develop. And they are informed assumptions, but they are assumptions nonetheless. So it is a projection.
And if I may, a quick follow-up connected to that. So when you were showing it, it's approximately 140 euros per kilogram of meat at the moment. And I'm wondering whether that price already kind of like includes some sort of environmental benefit, or like the cost of carbon, we might assume. And like the second question is like, if we would be able to somehow account for like the cost of carbon and the externalities and those prices of like conventional meats, like how much do you think it could speed up the process of arriving to like cost parity or somewhere close to cost parity with conventional options?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So no, it does not include environmental cost or benefit. It does not. It's just a pure cost of making it. And for sure, if we would monetize or if we would incorporate the environmental impact of meat in the price, then of course the price will go up. If it will be, if there would be a CO2 or a meat tax, and in some countries there are discussions about this, then obviously we will reach price parity sooner than that. The other thing that might happen is that because of the projected scarcity of meat, the price may go up and we may reach price parity earlier. But that's in a scenario where the price of meat will increase drastically, right?
Ešte vidíme jednu otázku, nech sa páči.
Cool. Check. Yeah. Sorry, Mark, I was late, so you may have answered this, but I was wondering, where does the money come from? What's the vibe? What's the sphere around investment from VCs and the industry? And connected to that is our governments, EU, etc., subsidizing it, maybe through carbon benefits, etc. But where does the money come from, basically?
Right, private. It's essentially initially the money came from long-term kind of or investors with a long-term vision on animal welfare, on environment. So more or less mission-driven investors, if you like. Currently, we see a fair number of VCs in there, basically for return of investment. And we do see a fair number of large meat producers. Cargill, Tyson, in Europe, Bell Food. So we do see actually investment of the conventional meat industry, if you like. So it's a mix of those. But unfortunately, there is very, very little public funding in this at the moment. I have been advocating this many, many times to all the governments that I get kind of an entry in, but it's hard. There is a program in Japan. There's a program in Norway. It's getting there, but it's very, very slow. There's not a single program in the Netherlands, although this was initially funded by the Dutch government.
Do you know why that is? Because Europe has been throwing money around with Horizon 2020 budgets like in billions, and they're not funding that. Do you know why that is? It's surprising.
Well, I have applied many, many times for Horizon 2020 projects, so it's a little bit of a sore point.
Sorry.
Of course, you can interpret some of the programs of Horizon 2020 as where this would fit in, right? And so we have done that. What I find, and this is not, I'm a little bit sad about this, but not that much, is that it's a very democratic process, right? So you have a couple of reviewers and like 5 or 6, and there's always 1 or 2 that say, I don't like this, and this is never going to happen, or have some sort of emotional and non-scientific response to this. And then it's dead in the water. So I have decided, and I've communicated this to some of the agencies, that really for radical innovations like these, for crazy ideas like these, the funding mechanism, the traditional funding mechanism is not very suitable. Right? So you have to find in those governments, and sometimes there are people who say, well, I don't care, we're going to fund this. We realize it's high risk, we realize that there are a lot of people opposed, we're still going to fund this because we think this is necessary. That occasionally happens, but it's not typically the way governmental organizations work.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Paul, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.